Our last presentation for the day is endovascular PAD treatment with drug-eluting devices in a registry focused on underrepresented minorities and women, 12-month clinical results from the first 500 ELEGANCE Registry patients by Dr. Giri. Jesus, can you make it any longer?
Thanks very much. I appreciate the invitation. I have the honor of presenting these results on behalf of our PIs, Maureen Cohey and Eric Secemsky, as well as a multi-specialty steering committee, which I was a member of. To put things in perspective, what is the ELEGANCE Registry? Well, it's a post-marketing registry aiming to study real-world practices and outcomes utilizing the Eluvia drug-eluting stent and the Ranger drug-coated balloon. The key differentiating factor between this registry and other post-marketing registries is that there is an intentional aim to focus on representing both women and racial and ethnic minorities in the registry. How was this done? It was done in several ways. First of all, the steering committee itself was diverse, as is seen here. But more importantly, site PIs were sought who may have access to populations that were enriched for minority populations. And that involved going to sites that perhaps hadn't been traditionally represented in clinical research. Additionally, various materials were created for patients to encourage their participation in research in many different languages and to try to meet patients where they were in order to try to increase the representation here. Finally, I'll just mention why this is important. It turns out that prior research has demonstrated that if you look at current PAD guidelines, those guidelines are based on studies that actually only were representing 33% women in the clinical trials that make up those guidelines, and shockingly, only 8% ethnic minorities. So we're at a difficult position because we know actually that right now in the US, over 40% of the US population, for example, are ethnic minorities. So what is the ELEGANCE Registry? I mentioned to you the basics, but another key factor here is that there's an intention to follow patients for 24 months. This, of course, with the drug-eluting or drug-coated registry is particularly important, as everybody in this room probably understands, given work that everybody has had to go through in order to create appropriate follow-ups in clinical registries for vascular patients and drug-eluting patients in particular. So what ended up happening? Well, the good news is that through these first 500 patients we're reporting on, the goals were met, and actually 41% of the patients in the registry were female, and 41 to 42% were racial and ethnic minorities. What was the breakdown here? Well, we have a 20% representation of Black Americans, and that's higher actually than the percentage in the population, which is fantastic. Also, you can see other representation here, including around 8% Asian Americans. I'm sorry, 12% Asians. And I'll be careful to say Asian Americans because that's not exactly true. There was OUS participation, most notably from China in the registry. And who was treated here? Well, first, let's just think about the overall background of the patients. As you can expect, the average age was about 70 years old, and they had very high rates of the comorbidities we associate with vascular disease, including very high rates of smoking at 80%, hypertension at 90%, and diabetes at nearly 60%. Roughly a quarter of the patients were site-identified as having chronic limb-threatening ischemia, while a third were identified as being Rutherford category 4 to 6. And as far as the lesions go, the lesions were typical, I think, more of real-world practice than of most prior studies that get presented during clinical research at meetings. And that includes lesions with an average length of 15 centimeters in the SFA, with about a third being total occlusions. When you look at how folks did based on their sex, you can see that a couple of key factors that came out here were that females were statistically significantly older, an average of 3 years older, and they were more likely to present in that Rutherford category 4 through 6 category. And from a lesion standpoint, the most important issue, I think, here is that the reference diameter, probably not surprisingly in females, was smaller in the SFA pop segment than it was in their male counterparts. When it comes to race and ethnicity differences, it's notable that Black patients, and actually all of the ethnic minorities, had much higher rates of diabetes mellitus, And unfortunately, they also had very significantly higher rates of presentation with advanced disease, Rutherford categories 4 through 6. This is something that has been seen in prior studies, including in work by Dr. Howard Julian in the NCDR PVI registry, where he identified Black patients as presenting with more advanced disease before getting to a cath lab for endovascular revascularization. And has also been demonstrated in work from both Dr. Alex Faneroff and Dr. Secemsky here in various analyses of CMS data. So not a surprise, but interesting to see it confirmed as soon as you properly represent patients in a prospective clinical registry. As far as what was happening from a lesion standpoint, I think the key aspect here that comes out is that we have a bit more involvement of the popliteal segment in Black patients. And the Asian population is relatively small, and it's more overrepresented with Chinese patients, but the occlusion rate was very high at 50%. And finally, to talk about outcomes, the outcomes were a somewhat reassuring portion of the registry, where we saw outcomes that were consistent with those seen in the investigational device exemption trials of these devices. As a post-marketing registry, you're hoping that what you see in the original trials will stack up to what happens in the real world when you start following the patients. And here you see roughly a 90% clinically driven target lesion revascularization rate, freedom from clinically driven target lesion revascularization, and that is almost identical to that which has been seen in those pivotal studies. And you can see that when it comes to sex differences, there was no difference in CDTLR. And when it comes to race/ethnicity difference, there's heavy overlap there in the confidence intervals, so no statistical differences there either. So in conclusion, a bunch of key points to bring out here. First is that it is possible through an intentional approach to recruit a representative population into clinical trials, be they registry or I would argue randomized trials as well, because the same tactics could be used for that. Secondly, there's no question that both female and Black patients are plagued by having more advanced presentations by the time they get to us in our endovascular suites. As I mentioned, this has been shown in prior research, but it certainly indicates significant problems in our healthcare delivery systems for properly picking up folks upstream with vascular disease. The final piece that's important and reassuring is that it looks like in this real-world analysis that, again, had lesion lengths of 15 centimeters with a third occlusions. We've got freedom from CDTLR that mirrors the very impressive results that are seen in prior pivotal studies. Thank you very much, and I'll take any questions.
Oh, thank you for your report. This is probably now the third trial. I've heard two just in this session, and I know the best trial, and probably I think there was another one as well that showed that they were able to close this disparity gap. I think it would be interesting. I mean, we can talk about everything with the patient, but I think it would be interesting to say, go back to the patients of all these trials and say, what got you to enroll? Yeah. Because we've written papers about what keeps them from enrolling, so we should be able to go back to these same people and say, okay, what encouraged you to enroll? Was it the investigators? Was it some type of trust? It would be interesting to see that, so hopefully we can get that answer, but I'm glad to see some of these disparities are closing.
I'm going to pass that question to Eric, who actually presented additional data from ELEGANCE just last week about patient survey and satisfaction results. And just if you want to give any kind of couple of lines about what a summary of what the patient perspective on participation in this registry was.
Yeah, it's funny. We were talking about this recently, trying to answer that exact question. And it's hard to do that in retrospect, unfortunately. Some of our hypotheses were we picked more representative sites with representative investigators, with representative study staff, and we thought maybe that had a role. And we were trying to dig into that a little bit, but it's a little bit hypothetical. We looked at, as Jay said, we presented this at TCT a week ago on patient preference and patient-specific outcome analyses and surveys about their care afterwards. And a lot of patients reported that they had family units and other members that were helpful in making decisions and choosing to undergo care, and that their overall experiences were positive, which was nice to see in a survey setting. But again, doesn't tell us why we capture them in this study versus others. So I have, my theory is that we're finding really dedicated clinicians who are doing fantastic work and they're enrolling in these studies, and we need more of those people, and that's probably our biggest gap right now. But it would be great, exactly like you said, Vincent, to look more into this.
Yeah, one piece to follow up on that, my partner Ashwin Nathan has looked at this specifically in clinical trials enrolling mitral and tricuspid regurgitation patients. And he was looking at a number of clinical trials to try to figure out what was a factor that could be associated with getting more representative populations into those trials. And by far the only factor that seemed to come out was getting to centers where the baseline population actually was representative. So if I think there's something that looks most important, as much as we like to give ourselves credit, that maybe we're doing a big deal, you've got to take your trial to where the action is.
The other thing too I want to comment on, by the way, phenomenal presentation, is also when we do clinical trials, the lights are on and the cameras are rolling. We have PIs, we have sub-Is, we have national coordinators, we have everybody. So if we can just take the energy we take into clinical trials and apply it to everyday life, maybe things will get better. So that's one point I want to bring up.
I think it's a really important comment. And this is, I've been so frustrated about, like, again, like when you see trials that have 70% statin rates, and it's like you have this moment where like you can do everything for these patients. You have resources, you have people, you have time, and then you're still stuck with these poor outcomes. And I appreciate everybody's desire to do CT-FFRs in the last session for ischemia, but also just put them on a statin, and we're probably going to get just as far as more testing and stenting. And so I think that's a great point, Zola. Yeah.
I also think it's important to consider, right, when we enroll patients in these trials, we're giving them all of this support, including removing the pain points of financial cost and several other things. And so when we complete a trial and we have great results and we have great enrollment, we also need to bring that data not just to the FDA, but back to CMS about what they're reimbursing. It's all well and fine that somebody has a mobile unit that will do a vascular ultrasound for a patient at home, or that they can get a subsidized ride, but that's not real world, because that's not what we get reimbursed for. And so we need to a little bit think about how we're approaching healthcare as a system in terms of preventative care and access, and bringing that back to CMS and Congress about what they need to help us with.
And also some of the insurance companies is with that. So we do have the ability to get some rides reimbursed and some other things, but really this is a public health thing. And so the insurance needs to get on board with making sure that these patients are meeting certain metrics before they get interventions, that they are getting these assistance. And I think that's an important part too.
So you described the registry report as the first 500 patients. How many more are you trying to recruit? Are you trying to recruit in different places or different people? What's the next 500?
Yeah, so the trial right now, the protocol states that it's a very large potential N, although it can be reduced, but it's up to 5,000, believe it or not, in terms of post-marketing surveillance. As far as different places, the answer is yes, there have been additional sites that have come online since now, and then particularly the international sites I think will continue online. And then we didn't talk about the relative proportions between Illuvia use and Ranger use, DES versus DCB, but the rates of the latter I think we'll continue to learn a lot more about as the patients accrue.
Thanks very much.